Meeting is being live streamed, it says. I'll just check and we'll start. Think. Okay, super, we're live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Carwan. Welcome back to those who are our subscribers. So this is a request. If you're new, click on the subscribe button so that you can get all the notifications whenever we go live. And today I am with Professor Lisa Mitchell from Germany, and Dr. Lisa um, is an associate professor of anthropology and history in the Department of South Asian Studies at the University of Pennsylvania in the US. And she received a PhD in sociocultural anthropology from Columbia University. And she has previously taught history at Queens College, Bowdoin College, and the University of Washington, and anthropology at the University of Notre Dame. And she's the author of Hailing the State, Collective Assembly and the Politics of Representation in the History of Indian Democracy, which is forthcoming, which will be published by Duke University Press, and Language, Emotion, and Politics in South India, The Making of a Mother Tongue, Indiana University Press, which was published in 2009, and it was published by Permanent Black in 2010, which was also a recipient of the American Institute of Indian Studies Edward Cameron Dimmock Jr. Prize in the Indian Humanities. She is currently working on a new book project on translations of globally circulating political ideas, provisionally titled The Multiple Genealogies of Indian Democracy, Global Intellectual History in Translation. And her research and teaching interests include the rise and fall of language um, as a fundamental and the foundational category for the recognition and reorganization of literary production, history writing, pedagogical practice, and assertions of socio-political identity in southern India, public space and collective forms of representation in the history uh, and the everyday practice of Indian democracy. The street and the railway station as public space, and the city and the built environment in South Asia, and also the Telugu language and literature. Today, Dr. Mitchell will be speaking about the book title itself, Tracing Genealogies of Indian Democracies, Methods for Global Intellectual History in Translation. So those who are joining us, welcome again. And if you have any question for Professor Mitchell, please send us those questions in the live chat. I'll be reading the chat towards the end, and hopefully we'll have a great discussion. Thank you so much, ma'am, for accepting our invitation. We were planning this for a very long time, and finally you are on Kahwan. Such an honor hosting you. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Eshan. It's really a delight to be here. I think I will go ahead and share my screen just to give a little bit of visual so you don't have to look at a talking head. Let's see. Okay, there we go. All right. Well, given Eshan has told me a little bit about Karwan's larger project, and given the fact that so many of you have deep interests in Indian history, I thought that I might today talk about some of my current research on translations of globally circulating political ideas into South Indian languages, particularly my own interest, Telugu. And I want to use these also to illustrate how the unique histories of the circulation of political ideas across South Asia have helped to shape ideas and practices of democracy in very regionally specific ways. And also, since so many of you are students or former students or maybe planning to go on and do graduate work in history, I thought that it might be useful while attending to the trans-regional circulation of political ideas that I could simultaneously highlight a series of methods that can help us better think about how to grapple with the very wide range of both regional continuities, but also regional variations in political histories, political meanings, and political practices across South Asia. So I'll summarize these methodological examples, and all of my examples will be drawn from my current work. But I want to summarize these methods under 4 methodological rubrics, with the caveat that these rubrics are by no means comprehensive. But the first one will be, I'll talk a little bit about mapping terrains of translation, and this is sort of a macro approach to translation. Second, I'll talk about a more micro approach, which is tracking very specific circulations of specific texts and reading practices involved in reading specific texts. Third, I'll talk a little bit about some of the challenges of translation. And finally, I'll talk about some of the structural binary oppositions that appear in the research I've been doing and that have actually helped to shape the languages and the ideas that we use to talk about politics in South Asia today. And while I'm going to be illustrating these four rubrics with an eye toward producing a much deeper picture of the unique ways that democracy has been understood and practiced historically in parts of Telugu-speaking South India, I think we can also use these rubrics, of course, to trace other trans-regional circulations of other kinds of ideas and practices. So you might take from these methods and apply them to your own interests. I want to begin then with an ethnographic encounter from 2012 while I was doing research in Hyderabad on the forms of political practice that were used during the Telangana movement, which, as most of you will know, culminated in June 2014 with the creation of India's 29th state. I was chatting with an activist who'd been very deeply involved in the various kinds of state-hailing practices that were used in the then very rapidly expanding efforts to hold elected officials accountable to their campaign promises to create the new state of Telangana. And those of you who followed the Telangana movement, there were many, political parties that were elected on the platform that they would create the new state, and then as soon as they got elected, they kind of walked that back. And so a lot of the collective assembly was designed to hold political parties to their campaign promises. So this particular activist and I were talking about the various dharnas and processions, road and rail roko blockades, janagarjana or public meetings, general strikes, and a lot of other kinds of activities that eventually brought about the creation of the new state, including very local practices like the Maha Road Roko or the giant roadblocks, examples of which have spanned in Telangana as many as 250 kilometers of national highway, and the Pale Pale Patala Paiki, or the villages on the railway tracks demonstrations that took place in 2011, in which people came out and they carried out all of their daily activities in the highway or on the rail tracks all day. So they cooked their meals, they slept, they did everything on the roads. And then suddenly, in the midst of kind of relating all of these activities to me, he suddenly nodded with great satisfaction and he said with great pride, "I always say the Telangana movement is one of the greatest democratic movements in the world so far that I have ever witnessed. Not even in the China Revolution did this take place." Now, his invocation of the China Revolution as the pinnacle of democracy is obviously clearly recognizable for those who are familiar with left discourses in India. But such a statement such a statement is actually quite startling to those for whom China and its revolution are seen actually as the antithesis of democracy rather than its pinnacle. And so his comments, I think, help to remind us that democracy in India has historically not been understood simply in local terms, as some anthropologists might argue, or sociologists, but rather it's been understood in transnational terms that actually differ quite dramatically from understandings in parts of the world that have historically laid claim to being the founders, promoters, and protectors of democracy. Places like the United States, France, England, and other European countries. So I think this example is just one among many that I've encountered over the past 3 decades of research in Telugu-speaking South India that suggests that our understandings of the history and meanings of democracy, as well as some of the ongoing ambivalences surrounding it and challenges to it, should not begin in 1947 with Indian independence or even with the implementation of the Constitution in 1950, a lot of the places where political scientists will begin their analysis of Indian democracy, or even with the slightly earlier introduction into India of British-style parliamentary elections. But instead, I argue that we must situate Indian democracy amidst the broader myriad of political experiments that were taking place worldwide over the course of the 20th century. Indeed, it's comments like these that have set me on the path of trying to implement the first and possibly most ambitious of the four methods that I introduced earlier, and that is namely mapping the broad terrain of the translation of the political into Telugu. So I conceptualize this historical terrain of translation at two levels. The first includes publishing projects that sought to translate political texts, political biographies, and political histories from English, Russian, German, Chinese, French, Turkish, and many other languages, though often via English, and often with bits of English often still present within the final publications, either bracketed glosses that are defining new Telugu terms or as an appended lexicon. The second level of translation includes performance and audiovisual traditions that have sought to translate and animate political concepts for much broader and sometimes more rural and less literate audiences. And here I've been recording and collecting scripts of Burakatta and Harikatta folk performance traditions, as well as films and collections of songs and ballads. Now, obviously, the number of translations of political texts into Telugu over the past 100 years has been voluminous. And so I have found it helpful in my own method to focus on collective translation and publishing projects that have produced multi-volume collections over a longer period of time, rather than just on the efforts of single individuals. And I want to highlight just a few of these collective projects for you here, just to give you a sense of how I'm structuring the project. So the earliest such major collective translation project in Telugu was carried out by the Vijnana Chandrika Grantha Mandali, roughly 1906 to 1934. This was a publishing society that was spearheaded by Komaraju Venkata Lakshmana Rao, who was the Divan of the princely state of Munagala, which is on the border of present-day Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. And its successor, the Jatiya Granthamala series, from about 1932 to the 1960s, which was edited by Ayadevara Kaleshwara Rao, who had been an active member of the Vijnana Chandrika Grantha Mandali and was also instrumental in the library movement in Andhra, and later became the first speaker of the Andhra Pradesh Legislative Assembly. To these collective projects, we can also add the Adarsha Grantha Mandali's publications. This was edited by Gadde Lingaya. In 1934, they published the earliest of at least 7 different Telugu translations of the Communist Manifesto and numerous other Marxist writings. At least one of my chapters will actually look at the different translations of the Communist Manifesto because they're quite different over about 7 decades. Also, the Vishwa Sahitya Mala that was started by which published between roughly 1938 and 1980, that was started by the brothers Mahidara Jagan Mohan Rao and Mahidara Ram Mohan Rao. They had joined the East Godavari Congress Socialist Party, and they published books every 3 months on a subscription series for a very, very low subscription rate. So they were able to get books into the hands of a lot of people. They published translations of R. Palm Dutt's works, including his writings on Lenin's teachings. They published parts of Marx's Capital and other writings on India. They published a book on Soviet democracy. They published Maxim Gorky's stories and biography, Chekhov's works, and as well as stories from China and many other things. I'm also looking at the writings of the Central Adi Hindu Social Service League that was established by Dalit leader Bhagirathi Varma, including their submissions to the 1937 Constitutional Reform Committee that was established by the Nizam of Hyderabad, as well as a rare collection of Burakatta scripts that were used to circulate knowledge of things like the Constitution, political rights, and a range of other political concepts, much more widely and popularly. And then the group that I'm actually most intensively working on right now, while I'm here in former East Germany, I'm currently based at the Max Planck Institute in Halle in the former East Germany. And the group that I'm working on right now are Telugu translators who worked for the Soviet presses, either the Videsha Bhasha publishing house, the Foreign Languages Publishing House, or Pragati or Progress Publishers. And some of these, in particular, the first listed, Uppala Lakshmana Rao, actually spent time in East Germany, in the former DDR. And he actually married a German woman who I'll talk about in a minute. And then the last group is the large corpus of songs that were produced and circulated by the revolutionary Jananatya Mandali, or the People's Theater Troupe. Now, what's really interesting to me is that a lot of these authors in these various projects all read English, but very few of them wrote anything at all in English. And so if you only read English, you'll have very little access to these various projects. And so there's really just the smallest scattering of discussions in English of a few of these various publishing collectives, their numerous publications, as well as even the biographies of the authors and translators who produced them. Dr. Shashikaran R.M., who's now at Flame University, finished a couple of years ago a very important dissertation at the University of Hyderabad on the Vijnana Chandrika Grantha Mandali. And there have been scattered short writings in English on the Adi Hindu Social Service League and Jananatya Mandali. But otherwise, there's so little scholarship on or record of these many really important collectives and their impacts on how people think and talk about politics. So in mapping the political dimensions of these various projects, one of my main objectives has been to identify the goals of each of these projects, document what texts or concepts the projects have translated, when, and why. The earliest of these collective projects, the Vijnana Chandrika Grantha Mandali, for example, was actually quite explicit about the goals of its project. Their very first publication in 1907 was actually a translation of William Thayer's biography of Abraham Lincoln, and it emphasizes his opposition to racial inequality. It also includes a collectively authored 15-page preface. Just as a side note, in illustrating what will be my second methodological emphasis on tracing circulation, the early Dalit leader Bhagirathi Varma in Hyderabad state reports having read this Telugu biography of Abraham Lincoln along with a biography of Booker T. Washington. So these translations that were made by the Vijnana Grantha Mandali were very influential and influenced people like Bhagirathi Varma. The members of the Vijnana Chandrika Grantha Mandali write in their prefatory statement, quote, "The development of language, Bhasha Abhivriddhi, development of knowledge, Jnana Abhivriddhi, and the development of the nation, Desha Abhivriddhi, are all synonymous with one another. Before trying to teach different disciplines to students in their mother tongue," and this is my translation, "we must first produce books related to all the disciplines in that language." So after outlining all of the different areas in which they see a pressing need for books in Telugu, they go on to write, quote, "So we, people who shared similar ideas and desired to serve the Telugu language with devotion, have established the Vijnana Chandrika Grantha Mandali, a society for Telugu language development, selflessly with utmost devotion and commitment to serve it." Since it is not possible for anyone to write about everything, we have decided to publish works related to only 4 subjects. And they define these subjects as history, biography, physical sciences, and then a 4th category, which they describe as other widely used texts in English. And it includes things like classics of liberalism, like J.S. Mill's On Liberty and the Subjection of Women, Spencer's Education, and the Scottish Chartist reformer Samuel Schmiles' Bible of Mid-Victorian Liberalism, Self-Help, subtitled On Character, Thrift, and Duty. Now, many of the works in the first 3 categories were published, but in the end, very few from this last category were ever translated by the Vijnana Chandrika Grantha Mandali. Nonetheless, the collective did end up publishing 38 books, at least that's how many I've been able to find so far. There may be more, but I've found 38 so far, which in addition to a wide range of texts on the sciences, disease, and agriculture, included biographies of such figures as Abraham Lincoln and Benjamin Franklin, political histories of France, America, the Delhi Darbar, South Africa, India, and Andhra, a book on Turkish democracy under Ataturk that was published in 1933, Prajaswamikam, Turuska Prajaswamikam, I think is the title, and then 2 volumes on political economy, all of which kind of suggest a fairly classically liberal publishing agenda, which we might be tempted to think of in contrast to the interests in translations of Marx, Lenin, and Mao that were more central to some of the other projects that I've just listed. And this is a question that I'll return to in a bit. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about my second methodological approach, and that is the kind of micro histories of circulation of particular texts and the reading practices through which these texts were received. And I want to illustrate this method using another collective of writers, and these were the dozen or so Telugu writers who produced translations for the Soviet Videsha Bhasha, or Foreign Language Publishing House, and for Pragati, or Progress Publishing House. And this was roughly between the 1950s and the late 1980s. At least 6 of these authors lived for some time in Moscow, but none, as far as I can tell, ever published much of anything in English. And there's almost nothing written in English about these various authors, their lives, or their numerous publications. One of the most prolific of this group, he translated at least, 48, maybe over 50 different texts while he was in Moscow. And he's actually the only one also to leave an autobiography in Telugu, which I've been in the process of translating. And this is Uppala Lakshmana Rao. And to illustrate how we might approach the question of microcirculation, I want to focus not just on Lakshmana Rao's large body of translation works, but on 2 of his original writings, his Telugu autobiography, Bataku Pustakam, that was published in 1983, 2 years before his death, and a 40-page pamphlet entitled Memu Congresslo Enduku Cherledu, or Why We Don't Support the Congress, or Why We No Longer Support the Congress, that was written in 1945 in conjunction with Melie Zollinger, his Swiss-German wife, and was published in 1946. And I want to look in both these texts at the extensive documentation of his reading practices and of the citations that he makes of other texts. So here, it's a really micro-analysis of what books did he read and what books is he citing, or are they citing. Now, Lakshmana Rao was born in Berhampur, in what is today Orissa, in 1898. And just after World War I, he traveled to Edinburgh to do his MA, and then on to Tübingen University here in Germany for his PhD in botany. During that time, he was part of a growing diasporic community of Indians in Germany. Chris Manjapra has written on that kind of diasporic community in Germany. He first met his co-author here, Melie Zollinger, in two begin in 1922. They became very good friends, and upon the eve of Lakshman Rao's return to India in 1924, uh, with his doctorate in hand, she proposed to come and visit him there. Actually, she proposed marriage to him, and he said, no, you first come to India, you see what India is like, and then only, we can talk about marriage. Indeed, she does later come to visit him in 1929. She arrives in India, and the two immediately go to the Lahore session of the Indian National Congress, and they stay in the delegates camp on the banks of the Ravi River in Lahore. They meet Gandhi and Nehru, and they both take the vow to work to the death for Indian independence. Solinger then lived for a time at Gandhi's ashram in Sabarmati. She participated in Gandhi's Salt Satyagraha in 1930, worked in a hospital in Calcutta, serving Dalits. She did some research on khadi handloom production in Andhra, and she herself adopted many of the nonviolent political tactics that were being widely utilized in the movement. She was arrested several times for her participation in the civil disobedience movement and was imprisoned for a total of nearly 2 years, both in the Vellore jail and also in the Vijayawada Taluk jail. She documented many of these experiences through a series of reports that were apparently published in German newspapers. Part of what I'm doing in Germany right now is trying to track those down. Solinger and Lakshmana Rao were married in 1937 at Melli's request, the Soviet Union, which Solinger argued was the only country where women were considered truly equal to men. Although the two did not officially join the Communist Party until much later, they described themselves as its admirers as early as 1930, and they were active members of the Friends of the Soviet Union, which was established in 1941, and later the Indo-Soviet Cultural Society, which was established in 1946. And I believe Lakshmana Rao was actually president of either one or both of those associations at various points. In 1956, they traveled to Weimar in the German Democratic Republic, the DDR, former East Germany, to attend an international symposium on the revolutionary poet Heinrich Heine, whom Lakshmana Rao had translated into Telugu. In particular, he translates one of his poems on weavers and the kind of working class ethos of weavers. While he was in East Germany, Lakshmana Rao was invited to Greifswald University, also in East Germany, where he ended up working for 2 years, from 1956 to 1958. And during those 2 years, both Solinger and Lakshmana Rao did a kind of speaking tour throughout Eastern Germany, and they spoke in many of the university towns in Eastern Germany. So they would have had quite a lot of interaction with local East German communists. And again, part of what I'm doing here in the former East Germany is to try and track down and locate copies of the speeches that they gave. I just recently received a copy of Lakshmana Rao's lecture that he gave at the Heinrich Heine conference. He was the only Indian delegate at that conference. And so it's very exciting to see sort of how he was thinking about the relationship between communist East Germany and India. In 1958, the two moved to Moscow, where Lakshmana Rao had been recruited to work as a Telugu translator. Melli died in Moscow in 1965, and Lakshmana Rao remained there until 1970. So he spent a total of 12 years in Moscow. Coming of age, as both of them did, in the context of the First World War and the Russian Revolution, the two actively participated in and bore witness to a whole series of really transformative events in the 20th century. They participated and bore witness to the Indian anti-colonial struggle, the rise of fascism in Europe, the trade union movement, Indian independence, and the range of experiments with socialism that occurred in India, Germany, and the Soviet Union following World War II. Now, I think there's a tendency to dismiss Soviet-funded translation projects as pure propaganda, but the writings of Lakshmana Rao and Melli Solinger are filled with a really palpable excitement that they shared with many others of their generation at the historical transformations that were occurring in the world during their lifetime, and at the really creative experiments with new political forms that were underway. These were political experiments that had never before been attempted. The Andhra historian Atluri Murli has traced the channels through which the Russian Revolution comes to inspire a whole generation in the Telugu-speaking regions of South India. And later, the Telangana armed struggle of 1946 to 51, with its radical commitment to land redistribution, was similarly seen not just in India but also elsewhere as evidence of the promise of peasant uprisings. So this couple's attraction to and excitement about the Soviet Union and about East German political experiments and ideas suggests that we can't simply dismiss their Soviet translation work as propaganda. And indeed, Lakshmana Rao was actually recruited because he had a PhD in botany and was capable of translating scientific knowledge. So a lot of his translations were scientific knowledge as well. Like the Russian Revolution, the Irish freedom struggle also played a very significant role in shaping South Indian understandings of the political. We know from Lakshmana Rao's autobiography that the Irish struggle against Great Britain or against England was widely reported on and was a topic of much discussion when he was growing up. Writes Lakshmana Rao, "My grandfather made me read the English newspaper, and during that time he made me acquainted with the Irish Home Rule movement, an interest which kept growing in South India alongside the rise of the Indian Home Rule movement." Ogetti Venkata Subaya Shastri's 1925 Swatantriya Lakshanamu is a translation of Principles of Freedom, which was the 1921 collection of essays of the Irish playwright, author, and revolutionary politician Terence MacSwiney. MacSwiney was the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor of Cork during the Irish War of Independence. He was imprisoned by the British government on charges of sedition under sedition laws that are almost exactly like the sedition laws that are still in effect in India today. And he died in Brixton Prison in London in 1920 following a 74-day hunger strike, an event that was widely covered in the Telugu media, the Telugu language media. The Telugu newspaper Andhra Patrika, for example, reported the news of his hunger strike and his death, his fast unto death. And an article, the Andhra Patrika article was noted in the British government's native newspaper reports, which is how I know about it. Venkata Subaya Shastri's translation appears to actually have been more important in Telugu than many texts that we might typically consider central to the history of liberalism in the West, such as John Locke or John Stuart Mill, which, despite the unrealized intentions of the Vijnana Chandrika Grantha Mandali to translate Mill, were not actually that widely known in Telugu until much, much later. And I think it's really important for us to ask, what does it mean that MacSwiney's writings were among the earliest writings on freedom to be translated into Telugu? Although MacSwiney is cited as an inspiration by a number of Bengali freedom fighters, including Jatindranath Das and Subhash Chandra Bose, as far as I can tell, Telugu is the only Indian language into which MacSwiney's essays were actually translated. Because I know there's a lot of historians today in the audience, I'd be really delighted if anybody here can tell me otherwise. If you know of a translation in, in Gujarati or Marathi or Bengali or Hindi, I'd really be interested in knowing about that. So the translation of MacSwiney's essays is also likely one of the earliest mediums through which the writings of John Stuart Mill make their way into Telugu. And it's not an auspicious introduction for Mill. Writes MacSwiney, and this is a quote. This is my translation of the Telugu translation, I believe. This is, when an aggressive power, Bala Vantalagu Waru, looks for an opening for aggression, it first looks for a pretext and our danger lies in men's readiness to give it that pretext. Such a sentiment as this from Mill on liberty gives the required opening. Despotism, Nirankusha Prabhutvam is the term that gets used in Telugu for despotism, is a legitimate mode of government, says Mill, in dealing with barbarians, Anagarika Jatalanu, provided the end be their improvement. So this is a famous passage in Mill where he says, it's okay for us to be despotic if we're dealing with barbarians, because in the end it'll benefit them. And Terence McSweeney goes on to write, we feel a natural wrath at all this, not unmingled with amusement and amazement. When the sincerest expression of the English mind can produce this, we need to have our wits about us. And when, as just now, so much nonsense and dangerous nonsense is being poured abroad about the empire, we need to pause, carefully consider all these things, and be on our guard. So this is how Mill gets introduced into Telugu. It's via Terence McSweeney's translation into Telugu. So given this introduction into Telugu, it's hardly surprising that Mill, along with other so-called liberal thinkers, have received a less than enthusiastic embrace as foundational thinkers for democratic practice in the Telugu-speaking regions of South India. Conceptual links between political imaginations in Egypt, Ireland, Russia, and India competed quite favorably with the influences brought by the British. And although English language histories make much of the impacts of people like Dadabhai Naoroji and others who praised the lineages of British-style parliamentary democracy, a closer look at vernacular sources suggests that these ideas intersected with and were often overshadowed by enthusiasms for other potential models of democracy, and also strong ambivalences, particularly coming from minorities and marginalized groups regarding elections and the potential for majoritarian domination. So we see this, for example, in the People's War boycotts of elections, or in Tamil Nadu, the VCK or Dalit Panthers boycotts of elections that the political anthropologist Michael Collins has so carefully documented, as well as in the ambivalence of Lakshmana Rao himself about the elections that were occurring without effective safeguards against the domination of majoritarian interests. And this comes out in the text that he publishes in 1946, Why We No Longer Support the Congress. One is also struck by the enthusiasm with which McSweeney's careful justification of the embrace of violence under very particular sets of circumstances are translated, or is translated into Telugu by Venkatasubaya Shastri, given the continued history of the defense of violence by Maoists in the Telugu-speaking regions of southern India. And there's in fact 3 of McSweeney's essays that are devoted to very particular conditions under which violence is justified. Resistance in arms, which Venkatasubaya Shastri translates as yuddham, and 2 others that are related to empire and militarism. So I think it's clear, given the time of its publication, that we should read the translation of McSweeney's essays into Telugu in relation to the widespread excitement that the Russian Revolution had already sparked in Telugu writings at the time, and that we can place those into a longer genealogy that connects the Russian Revolution to the Telangana armed struggle, including its battle against bonded labor and its briefly successful redistribution of land, as well as to the ongoing Maoist revolutionary sympathies and debates over the role of violence in the Telugu-speaking region even today. And I'm not justifying or glorifying violence, but rather trying to trace the genealogies through which these debates, the kind of texts that these debates were in conversation with. And one of the really interesting things is that these movements in Telangana it's very clear from the circulation of literary production across languages in India that the Telangana armed struggle itself inspired Indian revolutionary writers and poets throughout the subcontinent and beyond, and who held up the Telangana armed struggle as a successful example of a Russian-style revolution in India, and as an example of the prospects and possibilities of redistribution or redistributive justice that was possible for revolutions to produce. So the Urdu poet Kaifi Azmi celebrated the Telangana armed struggle in his poem Telangana, and the struggle was spread and supported by the play Ma Bhumi, Our Land, written by Shankara Satyanarayana and Vasi Reddy Bhaskar Rao in 1947. And then, that play was performed by more than 125 theater troupes that were formed and performed the play throughout the Telangana region, leading to estimates of more than 1,000 performances that are said to have reached more than 2 million people during 1948 alone. The Hindi and Urdu writer Kishan Chandra based one of his best-known novels, Jage, When the Fields Awaken, on the Telangana armed struggle, which in turn formed the basis of Bengali film director Gautam Ghosh's first feature film, also titled Ma Bhumi, or Our Land, written and produced by B. Narsingh Rao in 1980, which made the rounds of international film festivals and won numerous awards. So I think given all of this, it's perhaps not surprising then that early Telugu texts devoted to freedom and democracy focused on places like Ireland, Egypt, Turkey, and the Soviet Union, rather than on France and the French, the American, and even the British democratic experiments. The same Andhra Patrika news article that reported on Terence McSweeney's death also makes an appeal to the English. It directly addresses the British occupying forces and says to them, Ireland, Egypt, Scotland, Africa, Canada, and India are like your sons. You should look upon all these sons with equality. I mentioned earlier the account of Turkish democracy, Turuska Prajaswamikam, by Ayadevara Kaleshwar Rao that was published in Telugu in 1933, and other translations of a series of Soviet writers on Soviet democracy, Soviet Prajaswamyam, both of which were published by the second one was published by Mahidara Jagan Mohan Rao in 1943. And Mahidara Jagan Mohan Rao was also responsible for translating Mao's writings into Telugu in the 1950s, ideas that we know were quickly taken up in India and which have not completely disappeared, despite having been decisively displaced in China itself. Let me just return for a moment to Lakshmana Rao. He was sent to Germany in 1947, right after independence, to purchase some new equipment for the expansion of the cement factory where he was working as a manager at the time. And he describes in his autobiography the books that he and Melly read together while they were in Germany, including Marx's Communist Manifesto, his Constitutional Reforms and Revolution, his Class Struggles in France, and his Wages, Price, and Profits, all of which they read in German. They also read Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, also in German, about which Lakshmana Rao writes, according to Spengler, Soviet communism and parliamentary democracy are the symptoms when Western culture degenerates. The core of his philosophy is that to save Western civilization from destruction, it is essential to use Prussian militarism and fascism as a weapon to confront communism and parliamentary democracy. Lakshmana Rao continues. He says, that book makes a severe attempt to mislead people on communism, and we were tired of reading that book. So they kind of reject that. And he also suggests that the work really helped to turn students at Heidelberg University into fascists. From it, however, they do take the idea that both Soviet communism and Western parliamentary democracy are aligned together in opposition to fascism. And so there's a different kind of binary than the kind of Cold War binary that at least the West has adopted. During this time, they also read, and this is the last example of these kind of micro analyses of texts and how these texts are moving across languages that I'll give you. And then I'll move on to my third method. But the last thing that they read in English was the book Soviet Communism, A New Civilization by the British couple Sidney and Beatrice Webb. Lakshmana Rao writes of this in his autobiography. They put forth the question of whether the Soviet Union would produce a new man and answered the questions in the affirmative. Though we had spent only a few days in Moscow at that point, we could relate our experiences with theirs, and we felt thrilled reading that book. So there's just this real excitement with the possibilities of these new structures. Let me, though, now turn to my third kind of methodological intervention or framework. And this is the challenge of translation, the challenges of translation. Perhaps even more revealing are not so much the terms and concepts that do get translated across languages, but rather the terms and concepts that resist translation. One of the things that I've found most striking in doing this research, particularly in looking at translations of Marxist literature into Telugu, are the ever-present English glosses that are offered by translators to clarify key concepts. One of the things that's really interesting is that Telugu readers tend to have very little problem understanding the translations of Mao, partly because Mao uses a lot of agrarian metaphors and very concrete analogies. But translations of Marx are really hard to understand in Telugu. And so English appears in Telugu translations of Marx as a kind of critical language of mediation, both of Marx and also of Marx's commentators. Virtually any text that I've encountered that is either a translation of Marx or a commentary on Marx in Telugu is just riddled with brackets that have English terms and sometimes complete appendices at the very end of English Telugu lexicon kind of translations. Even texts that were originally written in German or Russian or other languages quite probably used English as a mediating language. It's likely that even most of the Telugu translators who worked in Moscow did their translations from the English versions, not from the Russian versions, into Telugu. Jessica Bachman, who's a PhD student at the University of Washington, is currently finishing a really interesting dissertation on the Russian archives of the Foreign Languages Publishing House, and she shared the Russian personnel files for another one of the Telugu translators I'm interested in, Rachamala Ramchandra Reddy, popularly known as Rara, which strongly suggests that he did not know Russian and that he did all of his translations from English into Telugu. Ramchandra Reddy also wrote a collection of essays titled Anuvada Samasyalu, or literally translation problems, that very explicitly addresses these problems of untranslatability. Translations of Marxist writings, as I said, almost always contain English glosses in brackets in the text itself, along with glossaries at the end. And it's clear that a very tremendous amount of labor has gone into trying to make Marxist writings meaningful in Telugu. And in addition to often appendices in books, there are also a huge number of Marxist lexicons that are just self-standing English Telugu dictionaries, and I'm sure that the same is true in other Indian languages. Another early group of translators that illustrates and actually, even the Communist Manifesto, as I said earlier, there have been no fewer than 7. I've found so far 7 different translations, almost one per decade over about 7 decades, which suggests that people were constantly dissatisfied with the translations of the Communist Manifesto that existed. And they often use quite dramatically different vocabulary to translate the same concepts. So that's one of the things that I'm really interested in kind of unpacking. Another early group of translators that illustrates the challenges of translation was a looser circle of collaborators that included J. Gurunatham, who was the chief editor of the Bhasha Sevaka Samajam, or the Language Service Association. And in 1910, Gurunatham published the first comprehensive comparison in Telugu of the constitutions and laws of the United States, Britain, and the government of India. A second member of this circle was Unava Lakshmi Narayana, who did his law degree in Ireland and who, together with Gurunatham, translated Thomas Paine's Rights of Man under the title Manava Hakkalu in 1908. Here, too, a large part of these authors' agendas was to make the Telugu language more capable of incorporating new globally circulating ideas. The preface to Manava Hakkalu bemoans the lack of books in Telugu that teach Rajakiya Shastramu, or political science, and stresses the importance of digesting new concepts into Telugu and expanding the power of the language to accommodate new meanings if we wish to pursue swecha, or freedom, even if it means loosening the tightness of existing grammatical rules and therefore angering learned scholars. In the interest of time, let me move on to my fourth and last method. We're all familiar with the history of Jawaharlal Nehru's embrace of Soviet-style economic planning through his adoption of 5-year plans, and the fact that independent India's central government structure is often portrayed as a hybrid that combines elements of Western-style democratic political institutions with Soviet bloc-style centralized economic planning. But I think less of an object of attention have been the ways in which globally circulating communist and socialist writings and ideologies have shaped understandings and practices specifically of democracy, of politics in India, not as democracies other in the kind of binary that has been shaped by the Cold War, not as communism, not as the other of democracy, but rather as a reflection of the widespread enthusiasm for the implementation of new communist and socialist experiments in ways that were hoped that people hoped would deepen and strengthen democracy. I want to conclude then with a fleshing out of this history of oppositions in the context of Telugu-speaking South India. Lakshmana, right, let's see. Sorry, let me go back to Lakshmana Rao and Melly Sholingar had both started out as avid Congress supporters from at least 1920, probably even much earlier than that. At the same time, their embrace of Marxism came out of their involvements in the trade union movements both in Germany from 1924 and in India from 1926-27. It's clear that at least initially their commitments to both Congress and Marxism did not seem to be a contradiction to them. In their 1946 pamphlet, Lakshmana Rao and Sholingar write, "Although we are against the current ruling Congress, we are not against the core principles of the Congress Party. Our family traditionally is a Congress one from the past 50 years. 60 or 70 of us were always khadi wearers from at least 1920. More than 20 of us have participated in the many different events of Congress. We have been to the Yenamarda Guru jails every other day. We who belong to such a family are leaving Congress." So they go on, and their writings really make clear that rather than seeing Congress and communists as having major ideological differences, they actually see a conflict, the conflict as a struggle over power and as a selling out to the interests of landlords and businessmen. They write, "Look at the history of Congress before 1942. Communists are the children of Congress. They were born and raised in Congress, and they did not descend from Russia." And at the same time, they also, Lakshmana Rao and Sholingar, identify affinities between Congress's own strategies and Russian intellectual and political traditions. They ask, where did Gandhi borrow the civil disobedience principle? It is from Russian Tolstoy. Nonviolence in politics, opposition to the war, all these we learned from Tolstoy. Don't forget this. When Congress says that communists are the product of Russia, then laugh and tell them about Gandhi's history. They see, so Lakshmana Rao and Meli Schollinger see Congress and Indian communists as having inherited a shared and very much globally circulating politics. It might be most accurate to characterize their vision as one in which Congress and Marxism together have created a new path against the forces of imperialism and fascism. And indeed, they write, by intermixing the Marxist way and the Congress way, we have formed a new path which we are taking to the masses. Their main complaint is their new distrust of Congress because of the way Congress has attempted to marginalize and push out communists, which was going on at that time, particularly in their decision to not allow any of the communists in Congress to contest seats in the 1945-46 general and provincial elections, instead branding them as traitors. They are also critical of the way that Congress is creating new organizations to compete with the peasant organizations and labor unions, and of their favoring of the interests of capitalist landlords and businessmen, giving them seats but not us. In essence, they see Congress as having abandoned the democratic principles, or Prajaswamya Sutralu, which they once shared with communists, and they express their willingness to rejoin Congress should they again embrace them. Today we are leaving Congress, but if Congress proves that its methods are correct and just, we will rejoin tomorrow itself. Please don't label us anti-national. By way of conclusion, I'd like to suggest that Lakshmana Rao and Meli Schollinger's writings frame communism and parliamentary democracy as a line together against fascism and imperialism, and that they see particularly aligned against British imperialism, highlighting the fundamentally constitutive roles of the concepts of fascism and imperialism in shaping vernacular understandings of democracy in Telugu-speaking South India as their most critical and defining other. The translation projects that framed these against tyranny and authoritarianism repeatedly invoked the concepts of aggressive force, balavantam, and despotism or tyranny, nirankusha prabhutvam. And they provided the overarching structural opposition with which communism, socialism, and democracy were framed. A passage from the 1922 novel Malapalli will give us a taste of the type of discussion of political ideas that we should be attentive to. The novel was written by the Telugu writer and translator Unava Lakshminarayana, who, as I mentioned earlier, had studied law in Ireland and had collaborated with J. Gurunathan to translate Thomas Paine's Rights of Man in 1908. While in prison, he wrote this novel, Malapalli, which was later banned by the British. In the novel, he portrays a speech given by the president of the Adi Andhra Congress, or Dalit Congress. In this passage, Lakshminarayana incorporates a passage in which the Adi Andhra president is illustrated observing that, quote, efforts were made in France and America to pull down and destroy the ruling class and the religious seats of power, and to give them to the movement of the people. But instead of a people's government in France and America, a government of the rich has come to be, and it is more injurious than it was in the past. Instead of the will of the majority, the rich are holding sway. The working classes are trying to change this situation. In Italy, factories of the rich have been occupied by workers, and in the end, the factory owners have had to compromise. In Russia, a Soviet government has been established. They believe that things should be done according to the will of the Soviets or societies of equals. In short, there's a long history of viewing the histories of democracy in France, the UK, and the US in ways that prevent them from being wholly embraced as ideal models for Indian democracy in the context of India, authorizing the ambivalences felt by minorities in the face of electoral politics. And instead, we find widespread circulation of Telugu accounts invested in ideas of freedom and democracy that focus on struggles and experiments in Ireland, Egypt, Turkey, East Germany, and the Soviet Union. My point here is that the production of this opposition requires a very long history of intellectual labor. The labor of writing, of translating, of selling inexpensive or giving away inexpensive publications, of performing, of singing, but that it produced an opposition quite different from the Cold War opposition that has shaped scholarship in the West. In the face of the most recent threats to the democratic values of free speech and freedom of assembly, and threats to the Indian Constitution and its definitions of citizenship, we can look back on the history of experiments and senses of possibility and excitement for remaking local worlds. Both the excitement felt by Nelly Schollinger and Lakshmana Rao in choosing to travel to Moscow for their marriage, where they believed women and men were more equal than anywhere else in the world, but also the sense of possibility experienced by Telangana state advocates, many of whom experienced something new in their sense of building a new, smaller, more accessible state, which many hoped would distribute resources and opportunities more equally. We may be tempted to look back on this earlier era of possibility with nostalgia, but I would encourage us to instead highlight the significant intellectual labor that has gone into producing writings, translations, theater performances, and songs in regional languages. As the authors of the preface to the first translation of the Vijnana Chandrika Grantha Mandali argued, those who know English and those who are wealthy have a duty toward the language and toward the readers of Telugu. Quote, now coming to the educated people, they write, they should help by publishing books in three ways: to write books in the Telugu language, buy books, and educate the public about the issues written in these books. I was asked some months ago to speak at a book release function for the Telugu translation of my friend and colleague Jangam Chenaya's academic book, Dalits in the Making of Modern India. The event was attended by both academics and non-academics, and it's clear that the translation was reaching a very wide audience. Similarly, the Farmers' Protest has systematically produced its own publications, the Trolley Times, translated into at least three languages. During the Telangana movement, similarly, there was a flourishing of cultural and literary publishing that occurred not just in Telugu, but in the Telangana dialect, which had not previously been widely utilized, or we can say the Telangana language. It's clear that in some domains and among some communities, translation projects into regional languages are alive and well. But the question I want to leave you with, and it's a question I ask of myself as well, is whether we are all doing everything we can, not just to study the histories of regional language literatures, but also to influence the shaping of the ideas that are available to think with in regional languages and the structural oppositions that frame contemporary political debates. What kinds of translation projects are happening today? Through what forms of media? And how is the presence or absence of these projects shaping the nature of contemporary political debates and the conceptual languages available with which to hold them? Theories of the political and their circulation within regional languages don't just describe the world that is, rather, they play a very significant role in actually shaping the political, defining what can be thought, what can be recognized as political, as well as what becomes invisible within a particular system of governance. I think, Ashan, I'll stop there and maybe we can open the floor for some comments and discussion.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that wonderful uh, introduction to a whole new word of vernacular understanding of democracy and the importance of the vernacular understanding of democracy as it is, and also the importance of microcirculation of such material that you mentioned, especially work done by Lakshman Rao and Lakshmi Narayana that you mentioned, and also the contemporary the Punjab Kisan movement, the farmers' protest, and the literature that was circulated. The writings of Bhagat Singh were circulated in Punjabi and in Hindi, in English, among the farmers to read and to make ideas for themselves for the movement. Uh, Also, an interesting part was the first part, the performative aspect of the vernacular, the Jananatya Mandali that you mentioned. And uh, so, how do you think such micro circulations or the micro understanding of the democracies in the local terms is influential at a macro level if we see at a national level?
Right. Well, that's such an interesting question, Ashan, and I think it's a little challenging, just because much of the scholarship that circulates about the history of political movements is all in English. And I think we don't, to the extent that we've looked at vernacular literatures, they've been sort of set apart as vernacular literature and so studied as something sort of separate. And obviously, there's a great deal of interaction between English and vernacular languages. And most of the people who are obviously the people who are doing these translations know both languages. But they're trying to, and this I think is what's fundamental, they're trying to reach an audience that isn't familiar with English. And as we know, that's a very large population. So at one level, you have ideas that are going back and forth in within each vernacular language, and then you have mediating figures who are crossing those languages and are capable of interacting with intellectuals in other regions. And so you have multiple levels of exchange. And I think it's a really big project, and I think it needs to start with each of us, everybody listening, kind of trying to think through these things in the particular vernacular languages with which they're familiar, and trying to kind of map what are these, what were the very influential texts? What were the texts that got repeatedly translated? How many copies were printed? How widely were they circulated? Were they sold? Were they given away at melas? Like I know in UP, Eshan, a lot of the Dalit literature was given away or sold at Dalit melas. A lot of that's not archived in any public archives. It's archived in private collections. So what got saved? What got put into archives? So these are all the kinds of questions that I'm hoping, to be working with many of you as well to try and create a better understanding of how we can use these exchanges across languages to think about how the political is conceptualized. That's a kind of general answer. I'm hoping that the book I'm working on will pick up, I'm planning to look at specific concepts in much more detail. But I'm at the early stages.
No, thank you so much for that answer. And yeah, that does make sense. That it is us who have to take the charge. And uh, my next question relates to that Lakshman Rao and Lakshmi Narayana both published their works, and especially Malapalli was published in 1922, as you mentioned. So, what was the early response to those translated works among the masses? What were the early reactions?
Yeah. Well, obviously, a novel that's published in Telugu is only going to reach Telugu readers, and so it's not going to reach those who aren't yet literate. And so I think in terms of publishing, still there's a limited readership for Telugu writings. And that's one of the reasons that I think things like the Burakatta and Jananatya Mandali and other kinds of more popular and even later cinema efforts to reach the masses have been very, very important. And I think there's a whole range of interesting projects, much more than I can possibly hope to achieve, but that many of you in the audience might be interested in taking up, to look at how that last category of analysis that I talked about, which is the creation of binary opposites. We tend to think through opposite pairs, black and white, good and bad. We tend to think through these kinds of binaries. And I think if you look at a film, or you look at a Burakatta performance, or you look at a ballad, or you can identify what these sets of ideas are through which people are trying to make distinctions. And often there'll be multiple sets and subsets embedded within them. And I think As a method, I think you know uh, I think we can trace what that impact was. Malapalli, very controversial novel because it was taken by the British as a direct challenge to their authority, and it was read by the British as a seditious novel, and it was banned. And So I think there were a number of strategies that were used by authors of the time to try and get past censors. Writing in somewhat coded ways. This was not a problem that only Indian writers faced. Antonio Gramsci, writing in prison in Italy, faced the same kinds of challenges. His prison notebooks were composed at a time when he had to kind of write in a code in order to get them published or get them out of the prison. So I think because they were banned, that actually gave them kind of much more cachet. In a sense, the British might have been more strategic not to ban them, because I think banning something immediately makes it coveted and more exciting and more valuable. It's a novel that today seems very a little slow, and it's written in a language that it takes some time to get through. So I don't think it immediately found a wide popular audience, even at the time that it was published. But I think banning it did kind of increase its popularity.
Modern democracies have learned their lessons. They don't ban that
Exactly.
on the spot.
No, well, and also with social media, it's all about attention, right? Today, it's about attention, and the news cycle is so rapid that if you ban something or you try to censor it on social media, that just gives it more attention. The best thing to do is actually, and what even like I think the Chinese government has discovered, is to come up with some more dramatic news story that displaces something, and then draw the attention away from it. So I think that's the strategy that a lot of governments are using to try and draw attention away from things that are considered to be challenges to its authority.
Uh, my next question is, we have talked about the early responses and that it took time to reach to the public, as you said. But did these translations or these ideas really influence the subaltern uh, in the mass movement that was going on during the freedom struggle?
Yeah, yeah. That's such a difficult question to answer, isn't it? I mean, I think some of the people who've done the best work on this are people like Shahid Amin in his Chowri Chowra, his event Metaphor Memory, where he really shows that the concepts that Gandhi had in mind and the concepts that local people, the subaltern peasant, the peasants or marginalized groups on the ground had, were often very, very different. And it's also clear that the Indian National Congress and Gandhi and Nehru had a very strong concern that they be able to control both the message and also the actions that were taken in the name of the Indian National Congress. And so, Shahid Amin just does such a brilliant job in that book at looking at both why Gandhi called off the non-cooperation movement, but also the ways that local peasants, local people thought, understood volunteer. Odiar is the concept and it keeps it in the local vernacular, Odiar, and distinguishes that from Gandhi's concept of the volunteer. And they meant very different things. So I think what's interesting about any political movement is that in order to be effective, it has to have many people behind it. And many people often have very different interests. And to form an umbrella that incorporates lots of people, you have to make your message as adaptable and flexible as possible. And I think that's always a kind of tension. And in fact, as soon as a victory is achieved, as we see, those kinds of temporary coalitions tend to kind of fragment. We've seen that in Telangana with the success of the Telangana movement. that not everybody feels like their needs have been met and the things that they had invested in didn't necessarily come to fruition. So I think there's always a tension between mass and particular sets of ideas.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for answering those questions. And I was throughout the lecture, I was making notes, and I think this lecture was very important for us to understand the meaning of democracy, or the popular understanding of democracy among the masses. Because as you said, you began by saying that democracies are not understood in local terms that it should be. And you mentioned about the people's strike of 2011 in Telangana. You talked about the Telangana armed struggle in this lecture, and the Jan Natya Mandali and other performative groups and their role in strengthening the democratic ideas, or their sense of democracy among the masses, and the importance of microcirculation of these ideas, as you said. And we also talked about the possible influences that it might had on the mass struggle at large that was going on in the 40s, and the initial response of the people. And an interesting bit of this that I learned was that early Telugu texts were based on Soviet or Irish ideas of democracy rather than the French or the British idea of democracy. That some believe that the democracy in India, the genealogy can be traced to the French Revolution,
Right.
but today you mentioned that that might not be the case. One must read the vernacular versions of early texts so that to get a fair idea of from where those ideas are germinated and they are brought to India and spread among the people. So thank you so much for pointing that out. I think it will be an interesting part for many people to research more further, because we believe young researchers, historians are watching this, and they might be influenced to research, not to form ideas, but to research, to form their own ideas and to question the existing knowledge, because that's the way forward to any advancement. Thank you so much, ma'am. And also a point before we leave, you also mentioned the Lakshman Rao's idea that communism and parliamentary democracy, the relation between the two is very much needed against tyranny and fascism as it is. So that is also a point that you mentioned in this lecture. Thank you so much, ma'am, for taking out time to deliver this lecture. It was truly an honor hosting you on Caravan.
Well, thank you very much, Ashan. It's really been a pleasure for me. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. And those who are watching us, if you have any question for Professor Mitchell, please email us at karwanheritage@gmail.com, KARWANHERITAGE@gmail.com, and we will be happy to forward those questions to Professor, and she can get back to you on email. We will be back with another lecture. We have a lecture lined up on 19th. I'll just share the title of the lecture, which is yet to be announced to all of you who are watching us. The lecture is Reading the Mahabharata from the Vantage of Masculinity, Karwan special lecture by Dr. Smita Sehgal from University of Delhi. So we will be rereading the Mahabharata. Um, and Thank you so much, everybody, for joining in. If you like the session, do like this video, do share with your friends, share the message. And it's very important in today's time to understand history from academic lenses rather than very popular WhatsApp narratives of the past, and keep sharing the knowledge of history because it's essential. Thank you so much, everyone.